Homeless man honors royal guard. What follows is truly heartwarming. In the heart of London, near the grand gates of Buckingham Palace, tourists gathered from every corner of the world. Cameras clicked. Children pointed in excitement. The sound of shoes on stone echoed through the air as the royal guards, dressed in their famous red uniforms and tall black hats, marched in perfect unison. Their faces were serious, their movements sharp. It was a sight many traveled far just to witness. But among the crowd, someone was always there, someone who didn't have a camera or even a mobile phone. His name was Graham Ellis. He didn't stand with the others. He didn't try to get closer for a better view. He sat quietly on a bench nearby, a few steps away from the palace gates, nearly hidden behind a row of tourists. His clothes were old and worn. His boots had holes in them. His hair was long and uncombed, and his hands were usually tucked deep inside the sleeves of his oversized coat. Graham was homeless. He had no place to call home, no soft bed to sleep in at night. The coat he wore had once belonged to someone in the army. It was heavy and faded, but it kept him warm on the cold London mornings. Every day, rain or shine, Graham came to the same spot outside the palace. He never missed the changing of the guard. Some people thought he came for the crowd or maybe for coins. But those who watched closely noticed something different. Graham wasn't there for attention. He wasn't there to beg. He came for the guards. He watched them with a kind of quiet respect, sitting still as they marched in and out, as their boots hit the stone ground with perfect rhythm. Sometimes he'd close his eyes for a moment, as if remembering something far away. Other times he would sit with his back straight, almost like he was standing at attention without standing up. The guards never looked his way. They were trained not to break focus, not to react to anything around them. But still, Graham watched. He didn't clap, he didn't cheer. He just sat there, always calm, always focused. People often walked by without noticing him. Some might glance for a second, wondering who he was. A few might assume he was just another man who had fallen on hard times, but none of them knew the full story. None of them knew that Graham had once worn a uniform, too. Years ago, Graham had served in the British Army. He had been a proud soldier, one of those men who stood tall and believed in duty, in country, in doing the right thing. He had trained for long hours, marched just like the guards did, and learned how to survive in some of the world's hardest places. He had brothers in arms, men who trusted him with their lives, and he had been proud. But life, as it sometimes does, took a turn. After leaving the army, Graham found it hard to adjust to normal life. The structure, the order, it was all gone. The world outside moved differently, and he struggled to find his place. Jobs came and went, friends drifted away. One day he found himself alone, with nowhere to go. Over time he lost his home, then his belongings, and then even his hope. Still, something inside him never left. That sense of respect for honor, for discipline, for service, it lived on. That's why every day Graham came to Buckingham Palace. Watching the guards reminded him of the man he used to be, the man he still wanted to be. It made him feel something. It made him feel alive. He had his favorite spot, a bench under a small tree, close enough to see but far enough to not draw attention. Sometimes he brought a small sandwich if he had the money. Other times he came hungry, but he always came. On one particular morning, the sky was gray and the clouds threatened rain. Tourists still gathered, holding umbrellas and wearing ponchos. The guards began their usual routine, marching in perfect lines. Graham sat in his usual place, nodding slightly as they passed. Suddenly, one of the guards slipped just for a moment. His foot caught a wet spot and he stumbled slightly before quickly regaining balance. The crowd gasped. Some laughed. A few took pictures, but Graham did something no one else did. He stood. Slowly, with effort, Graham pushed himself up from the bench. He removed his cap, a worn, old army hat, and stood straight. Then he raised his right hand in a sharp, perfect salute. His hand didn't shake. His posture was strong. It was the salute of a man who hadn't forgotten what it meant to serve. For a moment, time seemed to pause. The tourists stopped laughing. A hush fell over the crowd. Cameras lowered. People turned to look at the man standing in the back, saluting the guard with such deep respect. No one said a word. And though the guards are trained to ignore everything around them, one of them just briefly glanced in Graham's direction. He didn't break formation. He didn't speak, but that quick glance said everything. He saw him. Someone nearby filmed the moment. It wasn't planned. It wasn't staged. It was just real, a moment of quiet dignity from a man who had nothing, offering respect to a soldier who had stumbled just for a second. The video, when uploaded online, didn't seem like much at first, just a homeless man saluting a guard, but people watched, then shared again. Within days, the video had been viewed by thousands, then millions. Comment after comment poured in. People were moved not just by the salute, but by the story they sensed behind it. Who was this man? Why did he salute so perfectly? Why did it feel so powerful, so real? Soon, the world would come to know the story of Graham Ellis. But in that moment, in the quiet after the salute, Graham didn't know he had touched so many. He simply sat back down, placed his cap on his lap, and looked once more toward the palace gates. To him, it wasn't about the cameras or the crowd. It was about respect. It was about remembering who he was, and it was about honoring something greater than himself. The next morning, the weather had changed. The sun peeked through the clouds, and the streets around Buckingham Palace looked fresh after the night's light rain. The usual crowd of tourists began to gather again, waiting for the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Children laughed, flags waved, and cameras were everywhere. But something was different this time. People weren't just looking at the guards. They were also looking around, quietly, curiously, searching for someone. They had seen something special on their phones the night before. A short video. A simple moment. A man standing from a bench, taking off his cap, and saluting a royal guard who had stumbled slightly during the ceremony. It was the salute that captured hearts. The man in the video didn't look like someone famous. He didn't wear fine clothes or speak grand words. But his actions had spoken louder than any speech. It was the way he stood. The way he saluted, not like a tourist pretending to be part of the ceremony, but like someone who truly understood what that uniform meant. That man was Graham Ellis. The video had been posted by a tourist named Lisa who had been visiting from Canada. She didn't think much of it when she uploaded it, but within a few hours, comments began pouring in. Who is this man? That salute was perfect. He must have served. This gave me goosebumps. Someone find him. I want to help. By morning, the video had been shared across platforms. News pages picked it up. Former soldiers recognized the salute immediately. It was clean, firm, and respectful. It wasn't something a person learns from movies. It was something learned through training, discipline, and real-life experience. Graham had no idea about the attention. He didn't have a phone. He didn't check social media. That morning, he arrived at his usual spot, as he always did, quiet, early, unnoticed. He sat on his bench under the same tree. He held his old cap in his lap, just like every other day. But soon, people began approaching him. At first, it was just one or two. They smiled gently, nodded at him, and offered him a cup of coffee or a sandwich. Graham was polite but confused. Then a young man came up and asked, "Are you the man from the video?" Graham blinked. "What video? The one where you saluted the guard yesterday." Graham looked away for a moment, then gave a small shrug. "I just did what I was taught," he said softly. More people started coming, some just to say thank you, some to shake his hand. A little boy walked up and handed him a hand-drawn picture of a soldier, saying, "You're a hero." Graham's eyes watered, and he gently took the paper and tucked it into his coat pocket. Later that day, a group from a local news station arrived. They had seen the video and wanted to know more. At first, Graham didn't want to talk. He wasn't used to attention. He had lived quietly for many years, blending into the background. But the young reporter was kind. She sat beside him and didn't ask too many questions. She just listened. Slowly, Graham began to open up. He shared that he had once been a soldier in the British Army. He didn't speak of battles or missions. He didn't talk about medals or ranks. He simply said, "I served. That was my life. That uniform means something." When asked why he saluted the guard, Graham smiled faintly. It wasn't because he slipped. It was because he got back up. That's what soldiers do. The news report aired that night, and suddenly, Graham's story wasn't just known to those around the palace. It was being watched by people across the country and beyond. Messages flooded in from all over. Veterans who wanted to thank him, families who wanted to support him, and people who simply felt moved by his quiet strength. A local charity that helped homeless veterans reached out the next morning. They had seen the video and the news segment. They wanted to meet Graham, not to force him into anything, but to offer help, shelter, and a warm meal, no pressure, just an open door. When they arrived to speak with him, they didn't come with judgment or with cameras. They came with understanding. The man who greeted Graham wore a simple jacket with a small badge, a former officer who had once served as well. "I saw the way you stood," he said to Graham. "You haven't forgotten." Graham nodded slowly, unsure what to say. He didn't want pity, but he felt something different in these people. They weren't there to look down on him. They were there because they saw him. For the first time in years, Graham felt seen. That afternoon, another surprise came. One of the royal guards, off-duty and in plain clothes, approached the bench. He was tall, well-spoken, and held a small package in his hand. "I just wanted to thank you," the young guard said. "I was the one who slipped. I was embarrassed at first, but when I saw you stand and salute me, I felt honored. You reminded me what this uniform stands for." Graham didn't know how to reply. He just looked at the young man and gave a small nod. The guard handed him the package. Inside was a clean set of clothes, warm socks, and a note. It read, "To the man who reminded us what true respect looks like, thank you for your quiet strength." That night, Graham accepted the invitation from the veterans' shelter. He didn't want to leave the bench behind, but he also knew it was time. He packed the few things he had, his cap, the child's drawing, the note, and the coat, and walked with the shelter staff to a small, warm room waiting just for him. It wasn't a palace, but it was a start. Meanwhile, online, people continued to talk about the man with the perfect salute. Some offered donations to help Graham and others like him. A small fund was started by the same tourist who filmed the video, and in just 2 days it had enough to provide food, clothes, and care for dozens of homeless veterans. The city had changed for Graham, but more than that, the city had seen him. A man without a home had reminded everyone that honor doesn't wear a price tag. It isn't about rank or wealth or fame. It's in the small, silent moments, a salute, a nod, a hand over the heart. Graham had done something no one expected. Without saying a single word, he had touched millions. He had brought light to a life that many would have walked past without a second glance. And yet, to him, it had only been a simple act of respect. Because real respect, the kind that lives deep in the soul, doesn't ask for applause. It just stands quietly when it matters most. Graham sat on the edge of his small bed, holding the same worn cap he had saluted with days earlier. The room was quiet. It was warm, clean, and private, something he hadn't had in a long time. It had only been a few days since the video of his salute had gone viral, but everything had changed so quickly. He still found it hard to believe. Just last week, he had been sitting on the same old bench outside Buckingham Palace, minding his own business, as he did every day. Now, people knew his name. People were looking for him, not to chase him away, but to thank him, help him, and listen to him. The veterans' shelter had given him more than a bed. They had given him back a sense of worth. The staff members were kind and respectful. They didn't treat him like someone broken or helpless. They treated him like someone important, someone who mattered. One evening, as he sat with a cup of tea in the common room, one of the workers named Sarah gently asked if he'd be willing to share more about his life. She told him people were curious. They wanted to know who the man behind the salute really was. At first, Graham was unsure. He wasn't used to talking about himself, especially not to strangers, but Sarah wasn't pushing. She simply said, "Your story might help others." So slowly, Graham began to talk. He shared how he had joined the army when he was young, full of pride and purpose. He had loved the discipline, the teamwork, the honor of serving something greater than himself. He wasn't looking for praise or medals, he just wanted to be useful. Over the years, he had traveled to different places, helped in different missions, and made close friendships with fellow soldiers who felt like brothers. But when his service ended, life became difficult. The routine and structure he had depended on were suddenly gone. He tried to find work, but it wasn't easy. Things slipped away slowly, first his job, then his flat, then his savings. Some people helped for a while, but eventually he was left alone. The streets became his home, and silence became his closest companion. Still, Graham never forgot his training. He never lost his sense of respect for others, for the flag, for those still serving. That's why he came to Buckingham Palace every day. Watching the royal guards reminded him of the man he used to be. Their movements, their posture, their focus, it brought him peace. When Sarah shared some of his story online, people were deeply touched. They read about how Graham had saluted the guard, but now they also knew why. It wasn't just a kind gesture. It was a powerful moment of connection between the past and present, between a forgotten soldier and the symbols he still held dear. More messages came pouring in. Some were from soldiers, both young and old. Some were from families who had lost loved ones in service. Many simply wrote to say thank you, or to share how Graham's story had made them see the world differently. One letter read, Your salute reminded me to be grateful for those who serve quietly without asking for anything in return. One afternoon, something truly special happened. A car arrived outside the shelter with an official letter. It had the royal crest on the envelope. The staff opened it with careful hands. It was an invitation from the royal household. They wanted to invite Graham to attend a private tour of the Royal Guard's barracks. It was something not offered to the general public. It was a rare honor. When they told Graham, he was silent for a long time. Then he smiled, a small, quiet smile, and nodded. On the day of the visit, the shelter staff helped him get ready. A local tailor had offered to clean and fix up the old army coat he still wore, and another kind supporter had brought him a pair of new boots. As Graham stood in front of the mirror, he hardly recognized himself. He still looked like the same man, but there was a light in his eyes that had been missing for a long time. When he arrived at the barracks, several guards greeted him. They knew who he was. They had all seen the video. One of them even said, "Sir, that salute meant more to us than you'll ever know." Graham didn't feel like a hero. He just felt grateful to be seen, to be remembered, to be respected. They showed him around the grounds, shared stories of their training, and even let him stand beside them during a quiet moment. For a brief time, Graham felt like he belonged again, not as a visitor, but as someone who had never really left. Then came a moment that would stay with him forever. A young guard approached him, holding a small box. Inside was a silver medallion with the symbol of the Royal Regiment. The guard said, "This is not an official award, sir. It's something we made just for you, to thank you for reminding us of the meaning behind the uniform." Graham took the medallion in his hands and stared at it quietly. He didn't say much, but the guards could see his eyes welling up. He placed the medallion in his coat pocket, next to the child's drawing and the letter he had received earlier. These were the treasures of his life, now small reminders that even a quiet act of respect could echo loudly in the hearts of others. When he returned to the shelter, the other residents welcomed him like a friend returning from a great journey. Some clapped, others just smiled. But they all saw something in Graham that had changed. He no longer walked with his head down. He walked tall with quiet pride. Not because he had become famous, but because he had remembered who he truly was. In the days that followed, a veterans' charity offered him a place in a special support program. It wasn't just shelter. It included counseling, job training, and the chance to reconnect with old friends from his service days. Graham accepted, not just for himself, but because he knew others needed to see that it was never too late to find a way forward. He also began spending time talking to young people at the shelter, those who had served and lost their way, much like he had. He didn't give speeches. He just listened, shared his story, and reminded them, no matter where you are now, the strength inside you is still there. And so, the man who had once sat alone on a bench, unnoticed by the world, had become a symbol of quiet strength and respect. Not because he shouted or asked for help, but because he stood up when it mattered with a simple salute that spoke louder than words. Graham never asked for fame. He didn't need a stage. All he had needed was a chance, a moment to remind the world that sometimes the greatest acts of courage are the smallest ones done when no one is watching. But in his case, the world had been watching. And they had not forgotten. Graham sat in the quiet garden behind the veterans' shelter, holding a cup of warm tea. It was early morning, and a gentle breeze moved the leaves. He often came out here before the others woke up. He liked the silence, the peace. It gave him time to think. Since the day he had visited the Royal Guard's barracks, his life had felt like it was moving in a new direction. There was still a long road ahead, but he had hope now, something he hadn't felt in years. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out 3 small items: the medallion from the Royal Guards, the child's drawing of a soldier, and the letter from the guard who had stumbled, the very one who had unknowingly started this entire journey. These were more than just items. They were reminders of moments when people had seen him not as a man without a home, but as a person with value. One day, while Graham was sitting under his favorite tree near the shelter, a message came for him. A young volunteer walked up with a smile and said, "You've been invited to a quiet gathering this weekend. Some of the Royal Guards will be there. They said it's not a public event, just something special to say thank you." Graham looked at the invitation. The writing was simple and respectful. He felt a strange mix of emotions. He was honored, of course, but also nervous. He didn't think of himself as someone important, but something inside him told him to go. That weekend, he arrived at the meeting place, a beautiful hall near a military training ground. It wasn't grand, but it was filled with respect. There were guards in uniform, a few veterans, and even a few family members of those currently serving. It wasn't a big crowd, but it felt special. As Graham walked in, people turned to look. Some stood and smiled. A few walked over to shake his hand. One elderly man, also a veteran, said, "We've been waiting to meet you." The young guard who had slipped during the ceremony was also there. He wasn't wearing his red uniform today, just a simple shirt and trousers, but he stood with the same posture and discipline. He walked over to Graham and said, "Sir, I want to thank you again. That day when I stumbled, I felt like I failed. I thought I had let down the team, but when I saw you stand and salute, something changed inside me. You reminded me that mistakes are not the end, they're just part of the journey." Graham didn't know what to say. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder and simply nodded. Sometimes words weren't needed. A shared understanding could say more than 1,000 sentences. Then came a quiet moment in the hall. One of the senior officers stepped forward. He was a tall man with kind eyes and a strong voice. He said, "We are gathered here today not for ceremony, but for gratitude. Mr. Graham Ellis reminded all of us what it means to serve, even when no one is watching." He went on to share how Graham's simple salute had touched not just the guards, but people around the world. He spoke about the power of quiet respect and how a single action could shine a light on forgotten stories. Then something happened that Graham never expected. The officer reached behind him and held up a framed photo. It was a still image from the video, the moment Graham stood, cap in hand, saluting. It was now a symbol of silent strength, and it had been placed on display at the Royal Guards barracks as a reminder to all who passed through. "We see soldiers in many forms," the officer said. "Some wear the uniform, some once did. Some carry the values in their hearts even after the uniform is gone." Graham felt his throat tighten. He hadn't asked for any of this, but standing there he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. After the event, people stayed to talk with him. Some shared their own stories of struggle. Others simply said how much his actions had meant to them. A young woman told him, "My brother served. He never liked attention either, but he always said that respect is something you give, not something you demand. You reminded me of him." Before leaving, Graham was given a ride back to the shelter. As they drove through the city streets, he looked out the window. The same streets where he had once wandered with no purpose now felt different. They weren't just roads anymore, they were paths he had walked through both pain and healing. That evening, back at the shelter, the staff gathered to welcome him home. He wasn't just a guest anymore. He was part of their family. One of the younger residents, who had always kept to himself, walked up to Graham and asked, "Can you show me how to salute like you did?" Graham chuckled softly. "It's not about the hand, lad, it's about the heart." Still, he raised his arm and gently showed the boy how to hold his posture, how to bring his fingers to his forehead with purpose. The boy tried, then smiled. Over the next few weeks, Graham found himself slowly building a new life. The Veterans Program helped him with paperwork, healthcare, and finding part-time work. He started assisting at the shelter itself, cleaning up, helping new arrivals, and even organizing small group talks for those struggling with their own journeys. He didn't speak like a leader, he didn't use big words, but people listened when he talked. There was something in the way he carried himself, quiet, calm, and true. A local school invited him to come speak to students during a community week. Graham was nervous. He wasn't used to standing in front of a crowd, especially not children, but the school staff reassured him, "Just share your story, that's more than enough." When he stood before the students, he looked at the young faces and said, "Life doesn't always go the way we plan. But even if you lose everything, you can still hold on to respect for yourself and for others. That's something no one can take from you." The room was silent, not because the children were bored, but because they were listening, truly listening. After the talk, a girl raised her hand and asked, "Are you proud of who you are now?" Graham paused for a long time. Then he smiled gently and replied, "Yes, because I remember who I've always been." And in that answer was the heart of his journey, a journey that had started on the streets, passed through loneliness, and arrived at a place of quiet pride and renewed dignity. He never asked for recognition. He never wanted attention. He only wanted to honor something he believed in: the spirit of service, the strength of respect, and the beauty of standing up when it matters most. And by doing so, he had touched hearts. changed lives, and reminded the world of something powerful. Leaves turned golden and fell gently onto the streets of London. The air was cooler now, and the city was preparing for winter. Life around Buckingham Palace continued as usual. The guards still marched, the tourists still gathered, cameras still clicked. But for many, the memory of that one quiet moment, a man standing to salute, had never faded. Graham Ellis now walked those same streets with a different presence. He still wore his old coat, though it had been repaired with care. His boots were newer now, a gift from someone who had heard his story. He still carried the same items in his pocket, the medallion, the child's drawing, and the letter from the guard. These were part of him now, small treasures that reminded him of the journey he had taken. But Graham was not sitting on the bench anymore. He wasn't alone under the tree. He had found his place. Each morning, he volunteered at the veterans' shelter, helping with breakfast, sorting supplies, or simply being there for someone who needed a kind word. He had a gift for listening, truly listening, without judgment. People trusted him, not because he had all the answers, but because he understood pain and he knew how to sit quietly beside it without turning away. Every now and then, someone would recognize him. They'd say things like, "Aren't you the man who saluted the guard?" Or, "I saw your video, it meant a lot to me." Graham always responded kindly, often with a small smile. He didn't seek attention. He only hoped his story had helped others find their own strength. One day, the shelter received a letter from a school outside London. A group of students had been learning about kindness, courage, and respect. Their teacher had shown them the video of Graham's salute. The children had written letters, dozens of them, each one thanking him, admiring him, and sharing how they had learned something special from his story. Some wrote, "You showed me how small actions can have big meaning." Others said, "I want to be like you, kind and brave." One child wrote, "I hope when I grow up I remember to stand up when it matters." The staff read the letters aloud to Graham. He sat quietly as they spoke each word. His eyes glistened, but he didn't speak for a long time. Then he finally said, "If I helped even one of them, it was worth everything." In the months that followed, Graham's days filled with purpose. He began helping the charity create a small support group for other former soldiers who were struggling. They called it the Bench, named after the place where his story had begun. The idea was simple. Anyone who needed someone to talk to could come, sit, and be heard, no pressure, no judgment. The group met once a week in a quiet park. Sometimes there were 5 people. Sometimes only one, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that it existed, a safe space born from a simple moment of dignity. One afternoon, during a meeting of the Bench, Graham brought something wrapped in a cloth. He opened it slowly, revealing a small wooden plaque. It had the image of a soldier carved into it and the words, "Respect, courage, quiet strength." The members looked at it in silence. Graham said, "This isn't just for me. This is for all of us, for every person who's ever felt invisible but stood tall anyway." The plaque was placed on a nearby tree, facing the bench where they met. It became a quiet symbol in the park, not large, not flashy, but meaningful. As winter deepened, something beautiful happened. A new program was announced by the Royal Guards and a few veterans organizations. It was inspired by Graham's story. They wanted to create a way for former soldiers to stay connected to their past service and feel remembered. The program included small events, check-ins, and partnerships with shelters across the city. They asked Graham if he would be willing to be part of it. He didn't answer right away. He spent a night thinking. Not because he doubted the program, but because he wanted to be sure he was strong enough. He didn't want to be the center of attention. He just wanted to help. The next morning, he nodded and said, "If it helps others feel seen, then yes, I'll do it." Soon, Graham found himself speaking at small events, not as a guest of honor, but as someone who had walked a hard road and come through it with his heart still full. He never tried to impress anyone. He just shared the truth, that people are stronger than they know, and that no one should feel forgotten, no matter what they've lost. Sometimes he told the story of the salute. Other times, he told the story of the day a little boy gave him a drawing, or the moment a fellow guard shook his hand. But most often, he talked about the power of quiet respect, how it can change a person's path, even if no one is clapping. As spring approached, Graham walked to Buckingham Palace again. He hadn't been in a while. He stood quietly at the back of the crowd, just like he used to. The guards came marching out, sharp and focused, just as always. He watched them in silence. When the ceremony ended, a few tourists turned to leave and some spotted Graham. They whispered softly and smiled. A young girl walked up to him and said, "Are you the man who saluted?" Graham knelt down slightly and smiled kindly. "I am. But more importantly, I'm someone who believes in showing respect." She nodded. "Me too." He stood up, gave her a gentle wave, and then walked to his old bench under the tree. It was still there, worn but sturdy. He sat for a while, watching the palace gates. The wind moved through the trees. The city hummed around him. Graham took off his cap, placed it in his lap, and looked up at the sky. He had no riches, no medals pinned to his chest, but he had something far greater: peace. Peace in knowing that his small action had reminded the world that even in silence there is strength. Even in struggle there is honor. And even in the quiet heart of a homeless man, there can live a greatness that touches millions. Graham didn't plan to change lives. He only wanted to honor something he believed in. But sometimes the world needs a reminder. Not with loud voices, but with simple acts, like a man rising to his feet, removing his cap, and saluting with all the dignity in his heart. That was Graham's gift. And the world had listened.